so on. How do we use this? How do we go on? And so the idea was, we've now seen this complex and contested, and I think we really disagreed with some of Foucault's simplifications at emphasising the pastoral model and de-emphasising the Greek model, because we kept finding both there. How this complex and contested European history of Darwin might still be struggling to become rerouted in contemporary Indigenous context in Northern Australia in the goings on together of which we're all part as we do our research. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we'll see quite a few things that we probably disagree with Foucault about. So he's maintaining pastoral power is the idea of a power exercised on multiplicity rather than a territory. Well, we found that certainly much of contemporary modern government emphasised the multiplicity of individual sheep and was concerned for the welfare of individual sheep. So, as Gemma pointed out, they could provide good lamb chops, which is related to this idea of doing pastoral care to constitute better productivity in a way that we see so commonly. Okay. And as Elspeth pointed out, the idea of a territory is clearly there in the sense of national boundaries and votes, and so pastoral care goes to the edge of a nation state, and increasingly that edge of the nation state is entirely fraught, and with refugee crises. What we're having in detention centres, as those down the road, is having outsides constituted as little bubbles within the nation state. So detention centres really are reconstituting the boundaries of the nation state within the nation state. I think.
So the nation state is the Greek bit.
Yes, the territory bit, the vote.
Right.
Okay. We agree to be on this boat because we vote.
Yeah.
I vote.
I fish and I vote.
The refugee one is really interesting,
yes,
because it's really where the pastoral care and the territory and
yes,
the dilemmas that everybody's got, the moral dilemma that is throwing up for us.
Yes, yeah. And so this notion of boundary becomes much, much more active. It's not just, the coast of Australia. It's actually there, constituted by fences just down the road, the boundary of Australia.
And presumably the intervention where they had to get rid of Indigenous rights to their land.
Right,
That's another example when they had to suspend that in order to extend to pastoral.
Right.
Yes.
That's another conversation.
So we found it much more complex, these and much more active workings together of these two histories of governance that Foucault wrote us to. That guides towards an end and functions as an intermediary towards this end. Okay, so this is this productive notion, this constituting sheep as productive.
It's not an end in itself.
Yes. And so we disagree also with the third statement, that to govern is a power with a purpose for those on whom it is exercised, and not a purpose for some kind of superior unit like a city, a territory, a state, or a sovereign. And so I think we would want to, we agreed that should be contested as well, that it is actually both those. And the fourth one, it's a power directed at all and each in their paradoxical equivalence, and not at the higher unity formed by the whole and its individuated parts, which is also paradoxical, a different paradox, which simultaneously has to be managed. So I think that we're inclined to, Foucault's clearly writing about early modern Europe, and perhaps he's right, we don't know. But as we take as we use the text for inspiration to look at contemporary modern governance, we find that it's actually more complex than this picture suggests. Okay, so he suggests that this vision of pastoral care was planted at the centre of the Roman Empire, and I added perhaps the British Empire and the Australian state. So that basically let's leave Foucault to pursue his turning inside out of the state and its populations, and consider what we're doing when we're part of the continuing project of rooting contemporary modern governance in Aboriginal context. And my hope was that this reading would actually help us see that context in its mess and complexity, and also recognise the multiplicity of the objects that were objects of governance, as both found and emergent. And so taking this on to tomorrow, and the reading tomorrow, really, I chose the reading for tomorrow because I felt it began to give a sense of the sort of thing that was sort of working imaginary that's informing contemporary modern governance now. So we were going great guns before lunch.
Something about that, the paradoxical nature of everything, and a lot of what we do here in the North when we're working across, especially interculturally, there's all these paradoxes all the time. There's these things that don't, these puzzles, these conundrums, these things that don't resolve, that are better not resolved, but they kind of, like we were saying before, they create these active and generative possibilities, these sites.
Yeah, he's talking about two very specific paradoxes, and it's the paradox of the each constituting an all, and the whole, the vague whole and its parts. Now, I have a suspicion, and they work together and against each other. I have a suspicion that those two paradoxes also are very working in different directions, are very present in Aboriginal politics as well. If I was one of the researchers on your, if I was going into rubber giving, I would suddenly have my eyes peeled looking for the workings of what I see as those two paradoxes. One associated with the multiplicity of the governance of men, as Foucault calls it, and one associated with the governance of the boat, or the territory, or the boat story. And thinking, yes, I see, yeah, I can see that working there. So it seems to me that it is a way to begin to intuit some of the things that are happening in Aboriginal politics, which are very opaque. And I think I have no expectation I would ever be able to understand.
It seems to me with the financial literacy one that the ANZ or the TCU are thinking about that problem as being one that the entire Aboriginal population is excluded somehow through this process of marginalisation that came out of the financial crisis, and so that's treating them as a whole. But it's also saying that what we really need to do is get each individual bank account holder paying attention and doing the right thing by themselves. So there is a paradox there between the group and the whole, and I just can't see how that either of those two units are relevant in an Aboriginal polity, because there's something else going on apart from parts and the ones and meanings.
I think they're completely different wholes and ones. If you look at the different ways that Gurutu and Mark work, I think you can see some of the, and they tend to clash really just between them, so easily managed and almost trivial. But that's the sort of thing that I don't know. It's a movement that I'm intuiting. Elspeth.
I was just thinking, so we've not only inherited the kind of governance from the sort of Judeo-Hebrew Christian mess, but we've also, with Foucault, almost without realising it, inherited this particular paradox of the one and the many, and actually what you're saying is that's not even the paradox that applies in where we meet in Australia.
Yeah.
Those paradoxes that we're trying to analyse things through, they haven't even analytical tools in that context. They're also...
Just thinking about Julie's feasibility study for a corporation, even the government expresses it as a problem of how to work Aboriginal governance and Western governance together in constructive and honourable way. Well, maybe not honourable or constructive, but accountable ways that are accountable, where the Aboriginal people are brought to account for the commitments that they've made within the the Western framework of governance. You know, how many members have you got on your board? How big is the board? How do you work out who gets represented? How does the board work out who the manager's going to be? So all this stuff like that. So using this exercise to dig deep at some of the assumptions that are underlying the framework that they've got in their minds, and how it keeps getting undermined or relativised or changed by the ways in which the Aboriginal people react to the suggestions in the unfolding process. Like Julie's story about the woman saying, no, there's not many ways to do it, there's one way to do it properly. How those little interactions in the story actually point to the to our growing sensibilities of this.
I think that's right, and I think that that emergent story of how there's only one way to do it, we just don't know where it is. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And it's not. And to then watch very carefully to see how. Okay, I mean, what they're saying, we don't know what the whole looks like. We don't know that. But we do know that we don't trust that guy. We do know that that process is completely wrong.
And we need to talk to that person first, because they are the owner of the land or whatever.
And so the things that what do we know, and how that changes about what we might know next. So, in fact, plotting that process. And of course, lots of it would happen when you're not there. But you'd be able to intuit something that has happened when you're not there, because something will have changed, or getting people to talk about the story.
But maybe in an ethnographic sense, being aware of the other things that are playing around the edges, or playing, or where. So it's not just plotting the process that you're
seeing. Just having your eyes everywhere and being everywhere, and everything's. I mean, the problem with that is that everything's going to be relevant.
That's right.
And that's what doing ethnography is.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what you're looking for, so all you do is try to name a few things that are appropriate.
Can a little story's come to mind which just might be relevant here. I'm pretty sure I've told this story to Michael and Julie and Trevor, so I hope they don't mind. When we had a big men's ceremony out there last year, it was the coming out. It's been going on for 18 months, and it was about to have the coming out ceremony when people are allowed to go. And I was going out with a group of Indigenous women. We were going to camp the night before, but they were very nervous as we approached, because they didn't want to approach on the wrong track, because they would come out at the men's place and not the women's place. And so they kept making me stop. We were going on all these little tracks through the bush, and they kept making me stop or go back and wait, and they'd wait until a car came out, and they'd stop them and say, is this the right way to go? And this went on several times, went on for quite a while. And then my Yapa said to me, she said, I'm sorry, Yapa, or something like that. And I said to her, oh, it's okay. If you haven't been here for a long time, it's easy to get lost. And she was outraged. She said, I'm not lost. It's the roads that are a problem. And I was just thinking, like, in a way, Yolngu, this is not a paradox for Yolngu, that in a way that the relationship between the one and the many is not a paradox, like her relationship with the land and where she was not a problem to her at all. It was this superimposed set of roads that was confusing her, and they were the problem. And it's the Ballender governance system which is the problem, which creates the paradox. Not
or there are very well established ways of managing that paradox, which is just wait here until you can ask someone. It's a great story. I really think you ought to tell that story in elaborate detail and have it as a story for
It
this.
reminds me of years ago, Mike and I went fishing with this one kid, and he didn't catch anything. He was really, really cross, and he said something like, "These fish don't know me." He was annoyed at being kind of asked to fish, asked to get bait or something like that, in the wrong place because the fish were unfamiliar with him. So it's similar, I think, in a similar way.
I had something similar to the wording that the woman used to use in the project, and I was talking about pathways, and I'd said something, we were talking about the amount of change in schools, and I was talking with a woman and I said, do they not have confidence in the teachers? And it was the same kind of, no, they have confidence in the teachers. The children have confidence in the teachers. It's the universities and the programs that keep changing. And it was like subtext, you got it so wrong, Sue. Like, why haven't you been listening to me? Same kind of like you were looking in completely the wrong direction when I say that. It was a really, it was a good moment.
So those are the kinds of, and that gets back to that whole idea of disconcertment that I think was more a part of the last series of workshops, and noticing when that happens, and that is a really important tool that you can then use to say, well, what's actually going on here? And that idea, Helen, is a paradox like that same idea of those sort of ontological kind of clashes where you've got two different ways of, or is it not really?
No. Ontological clashes really a sort of interrupting, and it often emerges as a disconcertment.
Yeah.
I think this woman who said, no, not three, not ways. There's one way to do it, but it's so disconcerting, and that's multiplicity in practice. Okay, you're both talking about this project, and ontologically different things. And she's amazed that you think that that you'll come up with. So she's ontologically disconcerted, and you're ontologically disconcerted. And I think they're much more generative moments to follow.
Right.
Did you get to the place where you had to go in the end? It's just sort of opening up for me with that story. Is you've got the land and the people that know the land, and you've got this other form of doing stuff which involves cars. So you need to make roads over the land. So that's another layer: roads and cars. But somehow they managed to work together in the end, even though that layer was causing problems for people. There was still a way to get to where you needed to go.
That way she managed it. She went back to points where she felt happy and waited for someone to come along.
But was it,
So there must have been intersections that layer crossed that made sense.
If it
and made
had
work.
happened 1,000 years ago, she would have known exactly where she was, where the ceremony was, and where the women's part was.
That's right. Yeah.
And the
She
thing
would
is
just
that now she still wants to get there, and she knows where she is, and she knows where she's going.
But they're
she's
in a car on a road.
and they have to be following the roads. And she's going along saying, "This is going over that way a little bit, and really
Need to
going
be out
over
of
that
there.
way. I don't know whether it's going to turn around there." Or so it's the way in which pathways actually undo their sense of being able to know exactly where they are and where they're going, and that can cause.
But for me, maybe it's a good picture to keep in mind how two ways of governance might work.
Yeah.
That there may be points where they can cross up and eventually you sort of get there, but
Like when we get in a mess, go back to the places where the two maps fit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's rich for a few ideas.
Go and get out and walk if you know where you are.
Yeah, or is it about waiting until you can ask somebody, are we going the right way?
There's all sorts of ways of reading it.
Yeah, just in practice, very often if you just stop, which is often hard because our projects are time poor.
Yeah.
And there's a compulsion to have something, and so we run over.
Yes, but you might have gone a bit too far up the road, and you really need to come back so you meet people who can help you with the problem. So.
Yeah, so I guess the more people you're asking along the way, the less likely you're going to go too far up the track too.
Yeah.
If you can, I think it's
Well, there's also the chance of getting a few bump stairs.
Well, that's true.
People who don't know the tracks properly.
Yeah.
I think you ought to put a bit of time and effort into writing that story.
Right.
It's really useful.
It wasn't the end of the good story. I'll tell you that one later.
I wonder whether, going back to the whole and parts, when I think about visiting Daly River and working with those women in the childcare centre, particularly about training for certain, but now in terms of looking at that same space against the early years learning framework, it seemed to me that there was something about my disconcert being about what I was seeing, but more importantly, what I didn't see. You know, like it was the gaps, like literally some gaps in what, if I use a document, I'd tick or cross. But also those things that were actually amazing indicators of quality that I couldn't see until I knew until I was kind of gently told what I was looking for. You know, particularly the cultural, like the confirmation and reconfirmation of children's place and space in that childcare centre plus outside it. So, yeah, is that anything to do with Owen's
I think it is, and recognising that parts are emergent, and that's we're in a way so used to starting with a specified unit, starting with a specification, and then putting them together in one way or another, instead of saying, okay, well, we're sort of here, and then waiting until particulars emerge.
until we can.
Yeah, so in a way, the whole parts is going the other way. It's generative of situatedness.
Do you have any sense, Mel, what some of those criteria are in terms of the people you're working with in those being for long?
Can I tell you some of those criteria?
Yeah. Oh no, not the ones in the framework, but in terms of your engagement with the people in daily group.
You learn to see.
For me, some of the really, one of the strong ones was how children had an absolute role in the daily conversations that were going on. But the adults and children may have, in some ways, appeared to communicate very much at all, particularly compared with the preschool with the Ballantyre teacher that I was also seeing. But they would be talking to 3 or 4-year-olds in particular, in about who's visiting at the moment, or where did so and so go, and about the ceremonies, because there's been more than one funeral, and so that kind of engagement that was constantly, it was a surprise, I suppose, to me somehow, and it wasn't communication about their lovely work that they were doing for their
Wonderful way they lived there too.
yeah.
And blew their noses.
So it was about getting the child having a place in their social relationships because they're now culturally intent to just involve them with toys and they've got nothing to do with.
Yeah, and we see that that's their work
Okay.
rather than their work being absolutely a place in the social, the emerging social space and the kind of confirmation of where the child sits with. The adults absolutely assumed that this child would have information that they didn't have that was important to something happening in the community. And so they just totally engaged with him in a way that assumed that knowledge and assumed that would be something that he was appreciated for.
And that, just because I've got a child at childcare, that childcare is a part of the community. So there's actually they're not separate from each other in a sense. They constitute each other and they do work with each other and they relate to each other in the way that my daughter's childcare is like a little sort of portal that's dropped from the sky that she gets deposited into each day to do this mysterious work out of which I collect her at the end of the day and we go home and get on with our lives in a way. It's sort of interesting. And that tells us something about the suburbs and it tells us about communities and our lives and things like that. But it's a very interesting, different conceptualisation.
Or maybe the childcare is her life and you interrupt that by taking her home.
So she goes along happily enough. It's not that it's, there's anybody's...
Maybe she thinks she's a time traveller. They're two different.
But no one asked her about her grandmother. How's her grandmother?
No, that's right.
Or when the
It's
funeral would
different.
be, or when the like serious proper business.
Yeah, and the carers don't need to know a whole range of stuff. They don't
It's
think
like
the
a whole
child knows
separate
something that's going to be used to
Okay,
them in
to
terms of understanding what's going on here.
Well, there's that spectrum thing we were talking about. That in that play school that you were observing, there was a spectrum between young and old age that was interacting. Whereas in our play schools, there's a separation, isn't there? You've broken the spectrum up, so that the children can go in there and the play school teachers don't have to know anything about their grandmothers or their mothers. It's only about what children might be interested in doing.
Sometimes they have grandmother days, grandparent days.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a good, this is the extreme. I know that there's a lot nowadays that does interrupt.
No, I don't mean it there like that.
Yeah.
That in itself is an interruption.
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't saying it's a positive thing. I was just commenting that it's a different kind of yeah.
But I have been thinking about the spectrum of childcare. I worked for a couple of years with childcare workers coming into the university, and the way they described their daily life was very different depending on where they were located, in small, rural, country childcare areas to big cities, and it was easier to see how the big cities were portals where the kids were dropped down. There were small country and not so small country areas where they knew exactly where their grandmothers were, and it wasn't necessarily whether they were Indigenous.
That's right.
There were, so I feel myself sounding apologetic or defensive of certain childcare centres, but I'm thinking it's got a lot to do with place.
It has, and
And
size.
situated.
It also doesn't have a lot to do historically, and I'm sure Foucault probably has even written about this, with the designation of the child as a distinct object, because children used to work in Victorian Britain when they were like from the age of 4, send them down the coal mine, it doesn't matter. And so I think almost when they decided that shouldn't happen to children, they then created that boundary, and then they had to say, well, what is it that the child does? It's to speak
So
to
the
what
child
adults
becomes
do.
a knowledge object,
Yeah.
an object of knowledge produced by a set of knowledge practices.
And in order to make it a distinct object, you then have to remove it from this adult world that perhaps historically it would have been involved in the same way that Indigenous kids are maybe more involved in funerals and goings on at work and stuff.
Helen, have you got any advice or instructions for tomorrow?
Well, the article, I'm not very happy with the article I found for tomorrow. Bits of it are more useful than others. Read it with care, if you like. It's very much one to read against the grain. That's my advice, I guess, for tomorrow.
Okay.
And just do keep thinking about your object. So think about your object with the framing the complex, messy stuff we talked about today, and then also be thinking about it with respect to what it is you get out of the paper. So, if you like, you're meant to read these articles through your object.
And we have to start thinking about how we can produce 3,000 words.
Yeah, and what might go in that 3,000 words.
Right.
And many of the papers, many of the little stories this morning, I think already had the beginnings of attention and analytic tension. So be thinking about the analytic tension that might emerge from your story of the object.
And tomorrow we will also spend some time planning for how to unfold the next few months and what sort of collaborations. Good. Thank you again, Helen.
Okay.
When I say go, we all have to transfer this from a seminar room into a symposium room in 10 minutes. Okay, go.
Mark, did you send us a link to the live stream in one of the emails?
Yes. But you just go to the one on the whiteboard there, which is live stream. That's all of it now.
Press the button to the right of the shining blue button.